Welcome back to Sprague Homestead. I've been getting a lot of messages from a lot of you asking questions about when is it okay to inbreed, line breed, and that sort of thing in your rabbits. So we're going to make a video today that kind of talks about all of this, exactly what some of these terms mean, and when it's okay and when it's not okay. Now this also applies to a lot of other species, so we're going to talk a little bit about dogs, poultry, and goats when we talk about this as well, because a lot of the theories and fundamentals of this are all pretty much the same. So let's start with some of the terminology we'll be using so we kind of understand exactly what we're talking about. Of course, we all know that breeding is taking two individuals, mating them for the express purpose of creating offspring. But we also have some other things like crossbreeding. Okay, so when we talk about crossbreeding, what we're talking about is breeding of two individuals that are either from different breeds, different species, or different varieties. Now in the animal world, when we talk about varieties, what we're usually talking about is actually color, is basically what that breaks down to. So for instance, if you're talking about a solid blue line of New Zealand's, you might be outcrossing to a satin, or you might actually just be outcrossing to, say, a black or red. Now some of these things, of course, in color genetics and rabbits, and as my understanding in some of the goat world, there are do's and don'ts of breeding in the color world. We're not going to talk about that for today. We're mostly just talking about actual reproduction and when you're worried about genetic anomalies. But crossbreeding occurs when you take horses to donkeys with the express purpose of making mules. So it kind of is a catch-all. It covers a lot of stuff, whether it's within the species, within the breed, or within just another group. So within that, we're also going to talk about outcrossing. So what outcrossing is as opposed to crossbreeding, where you're taking two animals that are potentially in totally different groups. When you're talking about outcrossing, you are usually taking the same kind of animals. So in this case, let's say we're taking two blue New Zealands. And what it means to outcross them is that they are not related. So you are actually taking this one and breeding it out to, or crossing it out to a whole different bloodline. So that's kind of what you're doing with an outcross as opposed to a crossbreed. Now when we talk about line breeding, we're taking two animals that are closely related, and we're actually breeding them together for a purpose to, what as we call in rabbit breeding, lock in a trait. So what you're trying to do in this is basically in a line breed, say you're taking mom, so you take a male and a female and you breed them together. They make some really nice offspring. Say that mom has a terrific top line that you really want to get locked into your line. So what you do is out of her litter, you take the very best buck with that same top line and you breed it back to her. So the thought process here is that the next generation now will carry, you know, on average about 75% of this doe's genetic material. And so that's where you get into where you're really locking in some of these traits. Now with line breeding, you've got to know that not only will line breeding lock in good traits, if you're not careful, you can also lock in bad traits. So if you've got a doe that no matter how great she is and you're breeding her to her son, if she's got a recessive trait that you don't know about, say rye tail, malocclusion, some of these other things that can be hidden, weird color patterns, weird colors in general, different fur type. In Harlequins, we have seen this kind of thing where you line breed and you get satinized fur come out. This is a no-no for us. But this is how it happens, is you take a doe that is a carrier that you may not even know, and you breed her son back to her. Well, he may have inherited that recessive trait from mom, and that'll express itself in that next generation. Same thing if you're going the other way and you're breeding a female offspring back to her father. So you've got to be careful and make really good notes when you're line breeding, because you want to make sure that you're not inadvertently locking in the wrong traits. Now, a lot of people get line breeding confused with inbreeding. They think that anytime you have closely related individuals breeding together, that it instantly becomes inbreeding. That's not the case in the animal world. I realize that in humans, it's more apt to work that way for a variety of reasons that I won't get into here, but it doesn't really work that way in the animal kingdom. So when we're talking about inbreeding, what that basically means is that you've closely bred related animals over so many generations that genetic diversity has been lost, And this actually paves the way for mutations. There's a lot of different things I've seen crop up. This is how they've gotten all kinds of weird facial deformities. They think some of that's how you got into things like a malocclusion. You can get rye tail. You can get all kinds of birth defects, short ears, long ears, max factor, which is another thing. With dwarfs, you can get way more peanuts than what's normal is if you're too far inbred. So that's kind of what all that means. So inbreeding and line breeding, not quite the same thing. Line breeding is acceptable as long as you still have genetic diversity. Inbreeding is when you've lost all of that. So when is a line breed acceptable? Well, first thing, if you're going to do any kind of line breeding, you need to have a purpose. If your express purpose is just to make more rabbits, goats, dogs, chickens, whatever it is, unless you're going to eat every last one of them, please don't. Because of the fact that you are going to lock in traits and you're not paying enough attention to actually know what you're doing. So if you've got a goal, if say mom is producing fantastic growth rates, good mothering ability, and everything you want to see in a meat rabbit, by all means, take the offspring that most match what she's doing and breed it back and try and lock some of that in. But be very careful and keep a lot of good notes. This is, like I said, this is where you're going to start to see a lot of stuff pop out. There are some interesting line breeding charts online. I'll go ahead and put a little flash of that up here. It's kind of hard to understand when you're first looking at it. But basically, follow the little lines from A being your doe, I believe, B being your buck, down to the offspring, and just follow the little lines, and the chart on the other side will kind of explain basically when it says like 75% female, 25% male, that's what it's telling you that animal is the genetic makeup of the initial pair. So, you can be pretty far down that and figure out exactly how many of the genes you're pulling out of animal A and animal B. I don't use it. I know a lot of people ask me, hey, do those charts work? I don't use it. That's not what my goal is. To be honest, I have my own little rule of thumb that a girlfriend gave me years ago, and that is on a 3-generation pedigree, she doesn't want to see the same animal's name more than 3 or 4 times. That's what I shoot for, because in my mind, I breed rabbits, not paper, so I don't worry a whole lot about what's going on my pedigree, other than to make sure that 1, I'm not breeding any funky colors in, and 2, I'm not tightening up to the point that I'm losing my genetic diversity. So when we talk about a lot of this, I get the question of, is it all right to breed siblings together? Now, this tends to be a bit of a loaded question. For the purposes of line breeding, it's useless. The reason for this is because there's no way to know what traits, especially in something like rabbits, you don't know what genes and what traits that the buck, say, has inherited from mom and dad, and you don't know what the doe has inherited. Genetic research tells us that in most cases, these guys have no more than 33% of the genetics in common. So you're not really locking anything in, so it's not really doing you a whole lot of good. However, there is a time and place for it. It's okay to line breed siblings if you have a very small gene pool and you don't really have access to anything else. The reason for this is that because they only have about 33% in common, you actually have the most genetic diversity when you breed siblings together as opposed to breeding offspring to parent. Of course, offspring to grandparent is even better if you can do that, but I know a lot of us don't keep 3 and 4 and 5 generations of any certain animal in the barn. It's just not cost effective, and usually the rule of thumb for a lot of breeders is they keep an animal until it outproduces itself and then they replace it with that offspring. I'm kind of an odd duck where I have like 4 generations of Harlequins in the barn right now. And occasionally I will take an offspring all the way back to great grandpa because I have him. But again, I'm breeding rabbits. I'm not breeding paper, so that doesn't really worry me as much because I know that I've still got overall, even in 4 generations, I know that I started with unrelated animals. So I have not quite diminished my gene pool yet. So I'm sure some of you are going 4 generations. Oh my gosh, these guys are terribly related. No. So rabbits and poultry in particular are those kind of animals that you can actually line breed pretty closely for up to 10 generations before you've maxed out genetic diversity and start to actually see problems. The thing you run into is that most breeders, especially if you're doing pedigreed stock, most breeders are only going to offer you a 3-generation pedigree. So unless you know absolutely that you don't have any line breeding further back, the idea of just line breeding everything back in together doesn't really hold water, because you don't know if you're reaching that maximum or not. The other place that this gets kind of sticky is when you're talking about rare breeds. Things like cinnamons, American chinchillas. You've got to be really careful. This is why a lot of those breeds at one time or another have pulled in other breeds from outside and brought them in. In Americans, they've brought in Flemish Giant, which wasn't a good idea. They've brought in Beverin, again, wasn't a good idea. Standard chinchilla, they used Florida whites to improve type and kind of fur out the genetic ability on them. I had a really nice conversation with a breeder up in Montana who does cinnamons, and she said right now the gene pool has gotten so screwy because it's a rare breed and you've got pockets of them all over the United States that they want no line breeding or inbreeding of any sort if they can help it. Because what's happened is you've got pockets in one part of the country that are kind of developing different traits than what is being developed in Montana. So what you've got is basically the breed is evolving in two very different ways in different parts of the country because they're too isolated. They're also starting to lose a lot of the things that made the cinnamon great, which is mothering ability, litter size, and its ability to get up to weight. So you've got to be really careful about some of these things. And if you are going to be line breeding, be very, very selective about the offspring that you're keeping. I've seen people that take a 10-pound female and they end up taking a buck that they want, a son that they want to breed back to mom because he's got a killer top line, but he only hit 7 pounds. And so while you might be locking in the killer top line, keep in mind that you could be locking in some weight issues along with it. Once you've started really locking these things in, and they don't necessarily carry the genetics for the bigger animals or the smaller animals if you're going too far the other way, it's really, really hard to get it out. It takes a long time to breed all that stuff back out. So good notes are a must if you're going to be line breeding. So like I said, there are some species you really don't want to do a whole lot of line breeding on. It's my understanding that dogs, it's a no-go. You don't ever want to do it in dogs. We had a neighbor who used to breed Rottweilers, and she said absolutely not. I don't know all the ins and outs because I'm not a dog breeder, but AKC, when I sent an email off to them, they said it is highly frowned upon, which to me is a no-go. In goats, it's the same thing. They don't really like to see a whole lot of line breeding. I know I'm in kinders right now, and in kinders, while they say maybe once on a pedigree, they don't really like to see it. It's a breed that's still blossoming, it's still really getting going. So they'd rather you bring outside individuals and go from there. A lot of your milking goats apparently are the same way. And boar goats, it's my understanding that that's frowned upon there too. Cats are another thing. Nobody I know of purposely breeds cats. But if you're a cat breeder, apparently line breeding, not a good thing there either. So it's just a couple things to know. If you do decide to go on this whole little thing, there are calculators online called inbreeding coefficient calculators where you can actually put in your pedigrees. Some rabbit programs have this. Kintrax, which is what I use for my animal records, actually has an inbreeding calculator. And if you've got the ancestry of your animals, it's super, super handy. You just take 2 individuals, click a button, say out of 10 generations, what is my inbreeding coefficient? And what it does is it actually goes and it looks at the probability of an animal to have the same genes as an ancestor. So you can click on one of those and it'll kind of tell you, maybe grandpa, you're going to hit 40% of his genetic material if you make this match. So it can be kind of handy if you're thinking about doing some of that. You might want to pull one of those up. Like I said, I don't breed so much worried about the numbers. I don't breed so much about the paper, but I do worry very, very much about what kind of traits I'm locking in. So I hope this has answered a whole lot of questions, or at least some questions. If you've got more, leave them down in the comments. I know it can get a little bit confusing. But basically, when is it okay? When is it not? If you have a big enough gene pool to start with, parent to offspring, okay. Grandparent to offspring, that's fine. Offspring to aunt, uncle, that's okay. Cousins, that's all right. When you start tightening up, just remember good notes. Be very, very cautious and really look your animals over and be looking for those traits that you don't want to see. That maybe the weights have changed, maybe your hind ends have gotten pinched, maybe your growth rates have slowed down. I always suggest to people who line breed, if you're line breeding with the purpose of making an animal to replace, say, mom, if you're keeping a doe to replace mom down the road that has come out of say, a mother-son breeding, do not get rid of mom until that doe has proven herself to exhibit the traits that you're looking for. I know sometimes that's not possible. Animals get older. But I can share with you my own experience with this. I bought some Champagne d'Argents, and this is what kind of ruined me on the breed to begin with. I bought some Champagnes from a lady who had lost a doe after her first litter. So what she did was she kept all of the best offspring. She kept 2 bucks and 2 does out of it and line bred those things back in together. Well, I bought a pair of sisters 6 generations later, and now, even though they were cookie cutter rabbits, they were gorgeous. They had great fur, they had great color, they had great size. Nice big loin, nice meaty rear end. They were beautiful, not only for the show table, but the meat table. And one of them wouldn't breed at all. The other one never produced a litter bigger than 5. And a friend of mine who bought sisters out of the mother, the sister of the mother of these two, so they're cousins, had the same darn problem. One wouldn't breed, one wouldn't produce a litter bigger than 5. Now, I had talked to the breeder after that, and she said, well, I wasn't having any problems up till that point. But this is why it's very important to keep notes, because I think she got so focused on beautiful rabbits that she let all the other characteristics go, to the point that by the time we're 6 generations in, now keep in mind, I don't know what was behind that. We could have had a lot of inbreeding and line breeding in front of that. And I do say inbreeding at this point because by the time we start having fertility problems, I do believe we were probably line bred in about 10 generations, at least 8 or 9, knowing kind of how this gal had bred them. So know that going in. You really need to make sure that if you're keeping an offspring, that you are line breeding in the right characteristics. So good notes, absolutely. All right, so that's it. Like I said, questions, leave them in the bottom. I will do my very best to answer them. There is a difference between line breeding and inbreeding. I hope that kind of cleared that up. But if you've got a question about a specific cross, go ahead and let me know. That is it today from Sprague Homestead. We will see you next time. Happy homesteading.